On behalf of the Association of Chinese Americans, please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight, Frank Wu.
Thank you so much, Your Honor. It's great to be back home in the Motor City. What a night and what an honor to be asked to deliver a keynote address here on the occasion of your 50th anniversary since your founding. It's such an important part of this great city that I grew up in. We have a PowerPoint on the two screens, so I'll direct your attention there. And please do enjoy your dinner, and many thanks to the servers who have been so gracious and so attentive. Thank you so much. So let's go to the very first slide, if we might. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about how I came to write a book. I wrote a book called Yellow, Race in America Beyond Black and White. It came out about 20 years ago. And it started as a college term paper. I wanted to write a term paper about Asian Americans and civil rights. So I went to the library, to the card catalog. Now I know some of you are young and you don't know what that is. But before Google, you look things up in books, which were shelved in a vast library. To find the book, you'd go to a room bigger than this ballroom with these funny drawers, these cabinets, and these drawers, you pull out the index cards by title, by author, and by subject. I'm telling you this because I want to explain what happened when I looked up Asian Americans and civil rights. There were no books. And that's not because it was a bad library. Nobody had written that book. So then I thought, well, let me read about race. So I found many books about race. They were old, they were new, they were by liberals, conservatives, they were by historians, sociologists, you name it. And it didn't matter who wrote the book, because every one of those books, and I looked at dozens of them, within the first few pages, the author would explain that even though the book was based on the latest census statistics, and it had dust jacket blurbs from distinguished critics saying if everyone read this book, America would be a better place. I would start to look at this book and I would realize that I wasn't in it, that nobody was in it who wasn't black or white. You see, what these books did was they divided the world, they divided America, and they put people into just one of two boxes. And I thought to myself, that's not quite right. What I mean by that is it's not an accurate picture of the world. All you have to do is stroll across campus or walk down the street and you would realize there are people who are Latino, there are people who are Asian, there are people of Native ancestry, there are people proud that they are mixed ancestry. And so I wanted to challenge that and write a different type of book. So this first slide shows you the black-white paradigm. That's how we customarily talk about race. And the image there is of one of the long, hot summers, 1967 and 68. I was born in 67 myself. Some of you may remember armored personnel carriers rolled down Woodward Avenue. The National Guard was called in, and in city after city, there was unrest. And depending on your perspective, it was called either a rebellion or a riot. And it was so unsettling to the nation's leaders that they put together one of those blue ribbon commissions to investigate. It's chaired by the governor of Illinois, Otto Kerner. They wrote a book that's shown on the left. It's a government document, it's bureaucratic, but it concludes with stark language. They said America is not one nation, it is two nations, black and white. That title was then borrowed by an author, a professor. He's actually a professor at Queens College, where I'm the president now. And he wrote a book in the 1990s called Two Nations. And that's the book that's on the right on the PowerPoint. Black and white, separate, hostile, and unequal. So that's how we've talked about race. And if you're neither black nor white, that leaves you wondering, how do I fit in? As there are discussions about civil rights, as we address issues such as hate crimes, what happens if you're not in one of these boxes? So I wanted to bring Asian Americans into the picture. but to do it in a way that advanced universal principles. And next slide, please. And what I realized as I began to do work about race, I came across an author, W.E.B. Du Bois. If you don't know this person's name, you need to. He was a public intellectual, a giant before his day. He helped to start the NAACP. He was the editor of the magazine Crisis for decades. He was the first African American to earn a doctorate in the field of sociology, which was a new field then. And he wrote essays, he wrote plays, he wrote newspaper articles, and in 1903 he wrote a famous book called The Souls of Black Folk. It's never been out of print since then. As an author, I can say that's very impressive to have your book last more than a century. And he talked about dual consciousness. Before anyone talked about hyphenated Americans, he had his theory of the talented 10, that those who had achieved a modicum of success had not only rights, they had responsibilities. He was passionate. He was what was then called a race man. He was dedicated to African American equality in every sphere: social, civil, legal, political, economic. And in one of his essays, remember he's writing at the beginning of a new century, he wrote these words. He said, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." And he was prescient. He predicted accurately, and he was profound. Yet the way that I've shared that quote with you is inaccurate, because what he really wrote are the other words at the bottom of the slide. He said, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, comma, the relation of the darker to lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in the Americas and the islands of the sea." Now, lawyers are always taught to respect every word. None of them is meaningless surplus. And so what Du Bois did is he had a vision for black equality that incorporated people of every background. So he situated that struggle within a universal context, and that's the project that I would like to return to. So, you know, when I was an undergraduate, I had that conceit that all young people do. Every idea was mine, right? I figured I was the first person to think that idea. That's not so. Race beyond black and white is an idea that W.E.B. Du Bois had in 1903. It's that project to which I turn now. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do is just share with you a little bit about Asian Americans now and in the future. This is a slide that just gives you some sense of the Asian American population, and it's out of date. It's deliberately wrong. Why did I do that? Because this slide says there are 20 million Asian Americans, and I compared this slide before the 2020 census, so it was accurate at the time. But Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial group in the United States, so it exceeds by a considerable margin now 20 million. So this gives you a sense of the different populations, whether it's East Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian, and it is a booming population, even in places where you might not expect. I know that for many, thinking that someplace such as Detroit, or specifically where I grew up, Canton, that it would be so heavily Asian American, that would have shocked me if you had found me in the 1980s and said, you know, someday, this place where you and your brothers, you're the one and only, and you face the common cruelty of childhood bullying, someday this will be heavily Asian. 1 out of 5 residents will be of Asian descent. I would not have believed that at that time. Next slide, please. So this just gives you some sense of the diversity of the population. I have a slide specifically about the South Asian population and just how much internal diversity there is. So within diversity, there's even further diversity. Those from India, Pakistan, from Sri Lanka, and so on. Next slide, please. And for a long time, Asian Americans have struggled with identity, not just in the sense of who am I, or your children wondering how they fit in, but legally. So in the 1920s, 1 century ago, there were 2 gentlemen who went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, 2 gentlemen of Asian descent, and they wanted to be decreed white. You might wonder, why would they want that? Because back then, most people don't know this, there was a color bar. In order to naturalize, right, some of you have been through that process where you pledge allegiance to become a citizen of the United States, you had to be a free white person. So someone named Ozawa, of Japanese descent, and then someone named Finn, of South Asian descent, went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court and lost. They lost because justices said, you're not white. And if you're not white, that meant you couldn't naturalize, you couldn't claim the fullness of citizenship, equality. The American dream, which had beckoned to these upstanding non-citizens, just as it did to my parents later and to so many of you, they could never fulfill that dream fully because they were denied naturalization. Next slide, please. That's just one of the examples of what's happened for Asian Americans. But I also wanted to show how much Asian Americans have been part of U.S. history in a way that people don't recall. But the margins are making a new mainstream. So I want to show you a little bit about how Asian Americans have been involved with civil rights from the beginning and in coalition, following the lead of great African American leaders. So take a look at the central image on this slide. That's Life magazine. Many of you remember Life magazine. For kids, it was the Instagram of its time, right? It was the magazine that told you current events using photographs. So Life magazine ran this big pictorial feature in 1965 because Malcolm X was killed. The revolutionary leader, take a look at the photo, there he is, he's drawing his last breaths. He's lying in the Audubon Ballroom of New York City. It's 1965. And look carefully at that photo. Those of you that are far away might not be able to make this out, but I invite you to get up and take a look. You'll see there's a woman cradling Malcolm X's head. She's not a random bystander. She's Asian American. Her name is Yuri Kochiyama, and she was one of Malcolm X's closest confidants in the last years of his life. Part of his entourage traveled everywhere with him as a Japanese American woman who saw in his struggle for black equality something that was compelling to her as someone who had been in an internment camp. So there's an example, just one of several. Take a look at the image of the men and women dressed in their Sunday best, holding a banner that says Japanese American Citizens League, founded in 1929. That's one of the oldest Asian American civil rights groups. They're about to march with the young Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in 1963, under the hot sun, when he delivers the famous speech that we now know as his I Have a Dream address. But at the time, the JACL actually debated internally. Should we go to DC? Should we join? You know, is this too radical? But they decided they had to be there, and because this was back in the day, they put on coat and tie and dresses, because that's how you went to a protest under the hot sun. You dressed up for it. And take a look then at Grace Lee Boggs and James Boggs, husband and wife, right here in Detroit, revolutionary labor leaders who spent decades organizing auto workers. So these are just a few examples for you of how Asian Americans and African Americans have worked together throughout the years. But these are not photos that you will find in most history textbooks. You have to search far and wide for this evidence. Next slide, please. But it was reciprocal. Here's a photo of Dr. King himself. This is the March on Selma. Take a look at in the front. What are all the members of the front row wearing? Fresh Hawaiian leis, a symbol of friendship and love. Now, remember, Hawaii only joined the Union in 1959. There was no such thing as Federal Express. It was not easy to get fresh Hawaiian leis delivered, but a fellow member of the clergy, another preacher from Hawaii who had befriended Dr. King, made sure to send this symbol to show that Asian Americans were there too on this occasion. So this is just an example. I wanted to provide you with the visual evidence to have some sense that despite conflict from time to time, there has been coalition building at the grassroots level going back as long as ACA has been around. Next slide, please. Let me go back even a little further in history. So if you know one thing about Chinese Americans, you know that they built the Transcontinental Railroad. And that's true. That massive infrastructure project, speculative, the largest of its kind in the nation, something that displaced and removed so many people of native ancestries from their ancestral lands, it united this continent after the Civil War. It's finished in 1869 at Promontory Point, Utah. And the entire western half, so the Transcontinental Railroad was built in two halves. They went from east to west and west to east, and they met in Utah in the high desert. The western half, 90% or more of the laborers were Chinese men. At least 10,000, probably closer to 15,000, did the back-breaking work. That's a painting by Jake Lee. You'll see the men being lowered in wicker baskets with dynamite to blast their way through sheer granite rock face. You know that pejorative, racist phrase, Chinaman's chance? That's where it comes from. It refers to the risk that your dynamite, which is volatile in a new technology, will explode before you're hauled back up the side of a cliff to safety. So some of those laborers, they didn't make it. They gave their lives for the cause of the Transcontinental Railroad. Look at the black and white photo in the center. That's a photo that's iconic. It's part of a series. When they drove the Golden Spikes, that's when they finished the railroad. They had a huge ceremony, giant party. The railroad barons, or some called them the robber barons, they presided over this. And it doesn't matter how much you blow up that photo, there's something you're not going to see in any of the photos taken. And every educated person would know this photo from that time period, because this was the big news. They finished the railroad, right? And no longer did you have to have a perilous overland journey or sail around the continent to get from Boston to San Francisco. You could travel by train. But what's not in that photo? Anyone Asian. They were excluded from the festivities, just as they would later come to be excluded from the nation. So that photo is just, it captures everything about the experience that even though the backbreaking work, Chinese immigrant laborers did that work, they weren't allowed to join the party when everyone celebrated. To make amends, there's someone named Corky Lee. He passed away sadly of COVID, but you may have known of Corky. He dubbed himself the unofficial photographer of Asian America, and he was everywhere with his camera. Starting about 20 years ago, he did a pilgrimage. He took the descent. Oh, did we lose we lost the video on the top, exactly. So you see the color photo. He took the descent into the railroad workers. So these folks are by now 6th, 7th, 8th generation Americans, and they would go out to Promontory Point, Utah, and celebrate and take a photo to commemorate what their great-great-grandfathers had done to bring the nation together. So that's just another example. Let's go to the next slide. And even though I study this history, I'm sometimes shocked. I came across a book, it's one of the ones in the center, just a few years ago, and I didn't believe it when I saw this book, but it is real. It's not fake news, it's not Photoshop. There's a book about Asian Americans who served in the Civil War. Let me say that again. These are Asian immigrant men, and we're not talking one or two. There were hundreds of them. I mean, this just is amazing. And they're listed in this book. What the researchers did is they went to the archives and they looked through the rosters for the Union and Confederate armies, and they even found a handful of photos of the new technology back then, and documented that there were Asian immigrants, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, a number of Pacific Islanders, who fought in that monumental conflict. And then some of you know there were Chinese settlements all throughout the western United States, and there was terrible, vicious violence through the latter part of the 19th century. Entire towns were burned down, such as in Rock Springs, Wyoming. In Los Angeles in 1871, in one 24-hour time period, 1 out of 10 residents of Chinese descent was murdered. They were stabbed, shot, lynched with mob violence. It's just horrible to imagine that this happened, but it did, and the perpetrators in all these instances were not brought to justice because it was basically the entire town. And it was not just directed at immigrants, because the perpetrators themselves, many of them were European immigrants, and they had a racial rivalry during the gold rush time period. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through this next set of slides very quickly. I have a set of slides to talk about two of the dominant images of Asian Americans today. One is the model minority myth, the idea that every Asian American comes penniless and by dint of their hard work and intelligence achieves massive wealth and success. Whenever I talk about this, I always make clear, I applaud, I admire everyone who does that. I would not be here were it not for the sacrifices of my parents, just as would be true for so many of you. But I worry about the image that all Asian Americans are super successful, and I'll explain why just very quickly. Let's go to the next slide. So this is just a few of the caricatures of people of Asian descent that I have here. You know, people sometimes say, why can't you just take a compliment? People are saying you're smart and hardworking. So I'll explain why with 4 reasons. The next slide, please. The first is just to understand the migration from Asia. It is true that there are some crazy rich Asians coming, right? People with enough capital that they can buy a condominium and set up their children. Well, they're coming with human capital, right? They're scholarship students. But Asian Americans are more economically stratified than any other demographic, including other people of color. You might wonder, how can that be? Because there are 2 separate waves coming at the same time. One is well-to-do, the other is impoverished. People who are undocumented, they're rideshare drivers, they work at the all-you-can-eat seafood buffet. And so when you look at the Asian American population, you find that there is not just one uniform flow. You have both the wealthy and the poor coming simultaneously. And that's why you have such disparities. Next slide, please. The second reason I would suggest the model minority myth should give us pause is it whitewashes bias. When Asian Americans say, but we face prejudice, people say, oh, come on, you're all rich anyway, right? So it lets people deny that there's any problem. It leads people to believe that Asian Americans are so uniformly wealthy that they don't need social services, they don't need organizations. Actually, statistically, Asian Americans, this is a study from Harvard Business Review, are promoted to management at lower rates than any other group, including other minority groups, and that's even in Silicon Valley. So yes, you'll find lots of Asian Americans as lawyers or accountants at the entry level, right, in their 20s and their 30s, but once you get to directors and managing directors, vice presidents and CEOs, even in higher education, for example, in every leadership role that I've had, I've been the first and only Asian American to have that role. So it's really quite rare, even in the fields where Asian Americans are thought to be dominant. Next slide, please. The third reason that the model minority myth is troubling is it sometimes creates racial resentment. The great historian Rama Takaki said, Asian Americans are punished not for their vices, but for their virtues. Think about it. What is it to be hardworking? It's to be unfair competition the next day. What is it to be good with math and science? It's to not have people skills, right? So there's a sense of competition, racialized competition, that leads to a resentment of Asian American success. How come the Asian kids are winning every spelling bee, science fair, math contest, and so on and so forth? Next slide, please. Fourth and finally, sometimes this model minority myth is false flattery. It's not about Asian Americans at all. It's just a none too subtle way to say to African Americans, Latinos, and others, look at the Asians. They made it, why can't you? So it's just a taunt that ignores the different group history. So those are some of the reasons that I suggest, yes, we should applaud those who succeed, but when people portray it as if it's racial and stereotype, even when it's positive, we might wonder what that really means. Next slide, please. The other dominant image is the perpetual foreigner syndrome. This is the idea that I can't be from Detroit. After all, take a look at me, right? I must be an imposter, a liar, I'm a spy, a saboteur. I can't really be a Tigers fan, can't be who I say I am. Now, there's nothing wrong with saying that your parents or grandparents are from China or Taiwan or Hong Kong. But those are my parents. And they too eventually put down new roots and decided that they would make a new home here. Yet for Asian Americans, there's always the sense of go back to where you came from. Or even when it's phrased positively, how do you like it in our country? As if you're the guest and the other person is always the host. My, you speak English so well. People still ask me, where did you learn your English? Well, down the street from your kids. And yours isn't too bad either. Next slide, please. And the next slide, thank you. So, this has real consequences. It's not just name calling. It's not just being teased and taunted and challenged to kung fu matches when you're in school. The most famous example is the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. 2/3 of those individuals were native-born U.S. citizens. Men, women, children, the elderly, alike. They were imprisoned. Why? Because, you have to pardon this language, but as the lieutenant commander of the Western Defense, General John L. DeWitt said, a Jap's a Jap, that's all there is to it. He said, in this war in which we are engaged, racial affinities are not severed by migration. So his claim was, even if you're second generation, third generation, you love baseball, you only speak English, you're Christian, you've never visited Tokyo, nonetheless, you should be locked up. These photos are by Dorothea Lange, one of the most important photographers of the 20th century. And these photos have a fascinating story. You see how sympathetic they are? They show families. They just show ordinary people. They show the kids pledging allegiance, right? So the government commissioned Dorothea Lange to go to one of the internment camps to take these photos. But the photos were so moving, so touching, that the government impounded the photos. They seized them and they didn't let them be put on display. It wasn't until scholars 60 years later discovered these photos and published them. You'll see one of them, the one not by Dorothea Lange, it's a sepia tone photo in the center of the top. You'll see that it's a fellow in his uniform. He's wearing an army uniform from the Great War. That's what they called World War I, before there was a second World War. And he's of Japanese descent, so he fought for his nation, that would be the United States, and even though it's 25 years later, he has put on his old uniform. He almost certainly outranks the military police who could call summoned to lead him away. And you likely know that in Detroit, there was a huge contingent of Chinese American men and women who signed up for and fought in the United States military during World War II. So this history of service is long, it's deep, and especially here in Motor City. Next slide, please. The sentiment directed against people of Asian descent was so pervasive, I give you a couple of examples here, including cartoons by Dr. Seuss, right? So if you don't know Dr. Seuss, your children certainly do. Before he took that on as his pen name, he actually drew propaganda cartoons during World War II that depicted Japanese Americans as dangerous enemies within. Next slide, please. Of course, we all know the murder of Vincent Chin, so I won't speak more about that other than to say this was mistaken identity twice over. Someone of Chinese descent mistaken for Japanese, an American mistaken for a foreigner, and blamed for the success of imported cars in 1982 at the height of a recession. So many of you, that, as I did, went through this, and you know that in this terrible death, someone bludgeoned to death, his head literally cracked open, because for his attackers, he represented Tokyo, Toyota. They used racial slurs and then obscenities, and they ended up, and I won't repeat this, we're having dinner, but some of you know, according to witnesses, what they shouted at Chin before they took a baseball bat out and killed him. The Chin case is an example for so many of us in the Detroit area of what it means when people look at you as if you don't belong. There's the risk you'll be in the wrong place at the wrong time because of the color of skin, the texture of hair, the shape of your eyes. It doesn't matter if you're minding your own business. It doesn't matter if you, like Chin, are out for your bachelor's party, celebrating your upcoming wedding, so that the guests who would have gone to your wedding went to your funeral instead. You know, the perpetrators, they never denied that they did this. That's the other important aspect of this. They always admitted, because there were dozens of witnesses who saw the brutal beating. They said it was merely a bar brawl that had gotten out of hand. It could have gone either way. And they portrayed themselves as victims, that they were unfairly maligned as racially prejudiced, ignoring the fact that they killed someone. They killed someone in front of witnesses and served not a day in prison. You likely know. They were sentenced to probation for 3 years and a fine of $3,000. Not until the pandemic brought a new wave of violence have we seen something like this. But I share this and I pause, even though this is a joyous occasion, on this more somber note, because sometimes people say to me, well, just lighten up, get over it. Can't you take a joke? Just reply, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Well, you know, even as a kid, I knew there was something wrong with that, because it's the words that lead to the sticks and stones. And those words themselves, they pack a punch. Those are the words that say to your children and your grandchildren that no matter how hard they try, it's not enough. Because no matter how hard you try, trying harder doesn't overcome racial prejudice directed at you and your kid and kin. So I just want to share this slide, which just means so much to anyone in Detroit who remembers the 1980s. Next slide, please. So I mentioned Asian Americans in uniform and military service. These are just a few of the examples. You'll see Senator Daniel Inouye in the corner there with John F. Kennedy. If you look carefully, the photo's a little too small, you'll see there's something odd about his suit. One of the arms appears to be empty. That's because during World War II, he charged a Nazi bunker and destroyed it, but lost his arm in the process. You'll see so many others, including a Chinese-American woman who was one of 2 aviators in the Army Air Force during World War II, 2 of Chinese descent. Those who fought in Vietnam, the Filipino soldiers who promised citizenship for themselves and their families. They had to fight for generations to achieve it. Tammy Duckworth, the senior senator from a neighboring state, who when she first ran for office, her challenger, who was white and male, they had a debate, and Tammy Duckworth was talking about how the Duckworth family has served as soldiers for the United States for 13 generations. Her opponent mocked her and said, oh, he didn't know there was anyone Asian with George Washington in Valley Forge. Well, Tammy Duckworth is Anglo-Asian, if you had guessed. On her father's side, the Duckworths, she could be in the Daughters of the American Revolution because she can trace her ancestry back that far. On her mother's side, she's Thai Chinese. Next slide, please. I always pause to point out the diversity within the Asian American community, whether it's South Asian, Southeast Asian refugees, or Pacific Islanders. Next slide, please. And also people of mixed backgrounds. So my favorite jazz performer is Charles Mingus, and this is his second album, Mingus Dynasty. I let this album say a vinyl album. It came out in the 50s. So you might say, that's a funny image on the front of this album. And the title of his album is Ming's Dynasty, and he's dressed in Chinese regalia. You might say, is he mocking Asian people? No, he's paying homage to them. He's Afro-Asian. His grandfather came from Hong Kong. So that's why his second album is called Ming's Dynasty, and he's wearing Chinese robes. The woman being lifted in the chair, if you're Jewish, I don't have to explain that, that's a bat mitzvah. She's adopted. She's Chinese and Jewish. She's 13. It's her coming of age ceremony. So these are just a few of the images to give you some sense of the diversity within. Next slide, please. Also, some of the books, people are now uncovering these stories of the Jamaican Chinese, of Punjabi Mexicans in California, the mixing and matching that is what makes America great, and that happens here more than anywhere else. Next slide, please. So let me close now by talking about the pandemic. You know, it was an unbelievable 2 years that rendered the word unprecedented a cliche, right? People now want to go back to what is precedented, right? And when the pandemic first started, I heard from people who said that if they were of Asian descent and they coughed or had a sniffle, that people sort of backed away from them on the subway or the bus. And then there were some more reports about violence. So it wasn't just that people were worried you were contagious. They thought you were culpable. They were blaming you for a virus that allegedly originated in mainland China, in Wuhan. And at first people would say, this is just random, everyone's anxious, you know, we have to stay at home, and this isn't racial, these aren't hate crimes. But then there were so many videos that a pattern started to emerge. There were so many videos that it became undeniable that there were people being spit upon. There were people being shoved to the ground so hard their bones were broken, kicked in the head until they were in a coma. They were being stabbed. Finally, in Atlanta, they were being shot. One after another in a way that made it clear that this wasn't random. Now, as a lawyer, I know we have to have due process. You can't look into someone's heart or mind to know, in this case, was it a hate crime beyond a reasonable doubt? But when you have so many, dozens of these instances, and you've seen the headlines, no doubt you've seen the videos, and even today it's still happening. Chinese food delivery men being mugged, being almost killed, and in some instances being killed. It's just wrong. It violates everything that this nation stands for, our social contract, what beckoned to us as the American dream. Next slide, please. And you've probably seen some of these images. The fellow at the top, he was slashed in the face with a box cutter, permanently disfigured. He said when he cried out, nobody came. So many of these individuals, of course, are not of Chinese descent. The fellow with the box cutter, he was of Burmese background. There have been people who are Korean, people who are Filipino, even people who are Latino who look Asian have been brutally beaten by people shouting at them, "This is your fault. You made us sick," right? And of course, these are Americans. They're immigrants. They're native-born Americans. They're people just walking down the street, minding their own business. They did not go looking for trouble. The image in the center is a still from a video. You may have seen the video. I'm going to commend it to you because it's just a vertical gaze. But you may have read about this video. It's a shocking video taken at the height of the pandemic by security cameras in a luxury building in Manhattan. And what the video shows is a crime right in front of us. There's a fellow knocks a woman down. So many of the victims, women, elderly women. In this case, a woman who's Filipina on her way to church on a Sunday. The perpetrator knocks her down and starts to kick her in the head. Now, it turns out that later it was revealed that the perpetrator had a criminal record. He was a bad human being. and he did bad things that day. But what's truly shocking is about a 30-second video. If you watch it all the way to the end, the last 3 seconds, because as terrible as the attack was on that woman, it's crazy what then happens. At the end, you see 2 doormen, big, burly guys, bigger than the attacker, walk over and they literally close the door on the scene, turn around and walk away. They don't help the woman. They didn't help her when she was being attacked, and they didn't even help her get back up. She had to go to the hospital in critical condition in a coma. And these instances felt like, and still feel like, a reckoning. Suddenly people became aware of Asian Americans as never before. Asian American almost sounds like an oxymoron to some people. That's impossible. How can you be Asian and American? Yet the pandemic, with this brutal violence, gave people an awareness that they never had. Next slide, please. And I'm actually given hope. Oh, this is a slide just to mention that, of course, these attacks also had the gendered component to them. In Atlanta, especially, 6 of the 8 victims being not just Asian, but Asian women, killed by a perpetrator who admitted he did it. If you remember this news, the law enforcement officer who was investigating, who was assigned this case, I thought this had to be fake news when I saw it. No, he actually had a press conference where he said about the murderer who had confessed, oh, he was having a bad day. You know, just really astonishing, the disregard for human life. But people have responded. Next slide, please. This is the last slide. They've responded with projects such as the Yellow Whistle Project. Some friends of mine have been doing this. They give out yellow whistles because yellow is a color often associated with Asians. And it's imprinted with the motto, "We belong." And this allows you to blow on the whistle if you're being attacked, or lets bystanders become upstanders because they can summon help. And we gave out some of these whistles at an event that I want to close with this, because this is why the American dream is still so powerful for me as it was for my parents. About 1.5 years ago, so we didn't even have the vaccines yet, but there was a rally in Queens, the world's borough. That's where I live now. And it was in downtown Flushing, which is a part of Queens that in the 70s had fallen on hard times, like much of New York City, but was revitalized because of an influx of people from Asia. It's unlike any place you can find in Asia, because you have people of every Asian background, right alongside people who are Orthodox Jews, Italians, Greeks, Latinos, much of the great migration of blacks from the deep south, their descendants, and just all mixed together. But in downtown Flushing, there was a rally, and I was invited to be a part of this. The pandemic was still going. These hate crimes were daily news. And I said something to the people who were gathered that I want to share with you, which is, I'd never seen this before. I'd never seen so many people not of Asian descent. So Lieutenant Governor, then Lieutenant Governor, now Governor Kathy Hochul was the lead speaker. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer spoke. Civil rights activist Al Sharpton spoke. There were people who were white, there were people who were black, there were people who were Jewish, there were people who were Latino, there were representatives of the labor movement, there were people who were LGBT, people of every imaginable background came to a podium and said that they stood with Asian Americans. And I just don't remember seeing dozens of people ever do that. Not even when the Justice for Vincent Chin movement was at its strongest had I seen a rally like this. And then when I looked down at the crowd, I said, I've never seen this either. Asian Americans, the newcomers as well as the native born, the young and the old, it didn't matter what their politics are overseas, it didn't matter what their politics are here. They came together with signs, with placards to march, to stand up and speak out in a way that showed that they had become Americans, that they had joined this diverse democracy of ours. And so because There were so many on that occasion, an auspicious one, despite the terrible circumstances that brought us together. I thought, America works. This rally, and others like it across the nation, that gave people a sense that, yes, Asian Americans are Americans. And we have put down our stakes here. We have invested and bet on this great nation. This is where our children and grandchildren and descendants in perpetuity to come, this is where they will call home. And that's why it's so special for me to come back to my home, to Detroit, where I grew up, to celebrate with you. And the 50 years that you have had already have seen so much in Detroit, so much for Asian Americans, so much in each of your lives. But I have every confidence that as we come out of the pandemic with a sense, a renewed sense, that we can build something better in this experiment of self-governance, and where there's now a consensus as never before that we are obligated to bequeath to our children something better than was left to us. I have confidence that by working together, but only by working together, we will achieve the promise of a diverse democracy. Thank you so very much.
We have a special token of appreciation for Dr. Wu. Thank you for your wise words. And to present it, our ACA President, Eleanor Ho.